Bandits wipe out Guido Moretti's caravan, ruin for families, and leave Lorenz's merchants too terrified to move their own gold. Then Daniel Cross, an ordinary Manhattan banker with 10 years at JP Morgan, reveals he can transfer 100 crowns without moving a single coin. That modern knowledge will protect Guido's fortune, finance Mary Winter's forge, and build a 7-city banking network powerful enough to break a 50% lending monopoly. No sword can solve the problem, Daniel sees, because every payment in this world still travels as metal under armed guard. One correct entry in a ledger could spare a merchant from hiring guards, crossing bandit roads, or dying beside his own chest. With modern banking knowledge and a ledger, Daniel will turn paper receipts into money trusted across 7 cities. His system will protect merchants from highway robbers, fund widows who need to rebuild, and break an order charging 50% interest. But before rulers respect his documents and strangers trust his paper like gold, he must convince one ruined merchant to risk everything on him. The problem is that Daniel has no fortune, no allies, and barely enough copper to survive 1 week. Only hours earlier, he opens his eyes on a wooden wagon, his skull splitting, with something hard digging into his palm. A plastic identification card with the magnetic strip, the bank's logo, his name, his photo, the only thing left from his past life. Daniel lunges to sit up and nearly tumbles over the side. Up ahead, perched on the driver's seat, a gray-haired old man hunches over, guiding 2 scrawny horses. The old man turns around and grumbles that if a passenger is going to throw up, he should do it over the side, not on the bow. Daniel understands every word. The road is unpaved. No asphalt, no poles, no wires. A field of barley stretches to the left. To the right stands a forest of trees he doesn't recognize. Far ahead, rising above a hill are stone walls and a tower with a flag. A medieval city. Daniel looks down at his hands. The same hands. The same scar on his wrist from the server rack 3 years ago. He touches his face. The same face. He hasn't reincarnated into someone else's body. He has simply ended up here dead or alive. He does not yet know. And the world around him does not seem to care. He remembers the wet marble in the hall, the blow to his temple, the darkness, and now a cart with a bow. He closes his eyes for 3 seconds. He opens them. Nothing has changed. Panic is useless. He repeats this to himself once more, and he begins to watch. The cart pulls up to the dark wood gate with iron strips. 2 guards in chainmail lazily wave the old man through. The cart rolls inside, and that's when Daniel sees what changes everything. The market square noise, the shouts of merchants, stalls with fish and fabrics. And in the midst of the chaos, 4 men in leather armor are dragging that very chest. A 5th man brings up the rear, sword in hand. The man in the blue doublet is as white as chalk. The face of someone dragging everything he owns through the crowd, knowing that any passerby could snatch it away. Daniel stares intently at the chest, at the guards, at the pale man, and something clicks in his head. Not a thought, a click. 10 years at JP Morgan, 10 years of clearing systems and interbank transfers, 10 years of studying how money actually moves around the world, or rather, how it doesn't move. The dollar you send from New York to Tokyo doesn't physically fly anywhere. It stays right where it is. Only the record moves. But there's no record here. Money is metal, and metal has to be transported from point A to point B under guard at the risk of one's life every single time. Daniel laughs quietly. The old man glances at him suspiciously. They have no banks, no transfers, no receipts, no clearing, a financial desert. He is standing in the middle of this desert with 10 years of experience in the largest financial system in history. The cart lurches to a stop at the edge of the square. The old man mutters that this is Lorenz Square, and if the passenger wants to get off, let him get off. Daniel gets off. His legs feel like cotton. He's standing in the middle of a medieval town in a $2,000 suit with a pass in his pocket. People are giving him dirty looks. His clothes are too clean, too out of place. He looks like a madman. For the first 3 days, he's just trying to survive. He sells his cufflinks to a silversmith for a handful of copper coins. It's enough for a week's lodging above the tavern and 2 meals a day. The room stinks. The food is tough. He drinks murky water and prays to a god he doesn't believe in so he won't come down with dysentery. For 3 days, he wanders around the city and listens, and he notices something strange. When people chat about the weather or their children, he catches the general gist but loses track of the words. But when they talk about money and trade, he understands every syllable, every nuance, as if someone had planted a dictionary in his head, but only a financial one. He takes note of this and sets it aside. Over the course of 3 days, he maps out a mental picture. Lorenza, a city republic, neutral territory between 3 powers, a trading crossroads, 40,000 souls, ruled by a council of merchants, no king, no duke. It is the perfect place for what he has in mind. No one can order him to stop, while trade in Lorenza is already suffocating. The shops are emptying, caravans arrive less frequently. He hears the same story 3 times in one day. The Moretti caravan, a robbery, 4 families ruined. In the north, the 3rd year of crop failure. In the east, Velmar and Holdwick are dividing up the salt mines and everyone is expecting war. Merchants are afraid to transport goods. They're afraid to carry money. They're just afraid. On the 4th day, Daniel finds Guido Moretti's money-changing shop on the corner of a shopping street. A 2-story stone building, heavy shutters, a crooked sign. It's dark inside. A man in his 50s, with a grim face and red eyes, sits at the table. He does not want to talk. He wants to get drunk, and from the half-empty bottle on the shelf, he is well on his way. A piece of paper with the seal lies on the table in front of him. Daniel sits down across from him without being invited. Moretti lifts his heavy, vacant gaze and asks what the stranger wants. Daniel looks at the paper. Even upside down, he can read the numbers. A promissory note, the order of the scales, 55% per annum, an amount enough for 2 houses downtown. Daniel asks to take a look. Moretti shrugs. He doesn't care. Daniel flips the receipt over and asks for a pen and ink. Moretti passes the inkwell as if he's entertaining a madman. Daniel writes down the annual security expense first, and Moretti supplies the exact figure. Second line, losses from currency exchange in for cities. Moretti knows this too. Third line, the cost of cargo insurance with the Duke. Moretti spits out the number. Fourth line, total income after all expenses. Daniel calculates in his head. He writes it down. He turns the paper toward Moretti. Minus for percent. Moretti stares at the figure. 10 seconds pass, then 20. He still does not look up. His face goes blank. First confusion, then realization, then horror. He's operating at a loss. Every month, every year, he's losing money. Not because he was robbed. He's losing it because the very act of transporting gold from city to city is eating up his profits. The robbery simply accelerated what was already happening. Moretti looks up. For the first time, a spark of life appears in Moretti's eyes. He asks who Daniel really is. Daniel replies that he's a man who knows how to transport money without actually transporting it. Moretti is silent. Daniel presses on. He needs 1 chest of gold, not as a gift, for safekeeping. Moretti hands over the chest. Daniel presents a document with the seal and the exact amount. When Moretti's man arrives in Velmar and shows this document, he'll receive exactly the same amount of gold. No transportation, no guards, no exchange losses, a 2% commission. Moretti says that's impossible, but Daniel says it's simple arithmetic. Moretti says Daniel doesn't have any gold in Velmar. Daniel agrees. Not yet. So, we'll start with 1 chest and 1 route. He'll find a merchant in Velmar who needs to ship gold to Lorenza. 2 chests will be put in place. Not a single one will budge. Moretti doesn't understand. Then he does. His eyes widen. It's like a magic trick. Daniel replies that all finance is a magic trick. The only question is who the magician is. Moretti is silent for a full minute. Then he calls for his son. He orders his son to bring a small chest by nightfall, just enough for a trial. Daniel nods. He stands up. He walks to the door. He freezes on the threshold. The pass in his breast pocket is warm, not from his body on its own. Daniel touches it through the fabric. The plastic warms his palm. He doesn't know what it means. He steps out onto the street, and for the first time in for days, feels like he has a plan. A bad one, a dangerous one, a crazy one, but a plan. The trunk arrived that night, a small one reinforced with 2 iron bands. Moretti's son, named Lorenzo, brought it on a handcart accompanied by a single guard. The guard was a big man, a sword at his hip, an unfriendly look in his eyes. Lorenzo was a skinny guy in his 20s with a thin mustache and an expression that said he thought his father's scheme was madness. Daniel was waiting for them in the tavern's courtyard. He had rented a basement room from the owner. Stone walls, 1 door, no windows, a flimsy lock. It was a terrible storage place. Daniel knew this better than anyone, but it was a start. He opened the chest in front of Lorenzo. He counted the coins. Velmar silver crowns, 120 of them. He wrote down the number on a sheet of paper, the date, the depositor's name, a description of the coins, the total weight. He signed it. He pressed his thumbprint in place of a seal, because he didn't have a seal. Lorenzo watched with a smirk. He said his father must have been completely desperate to trust his money to a nameless vagabond. Daniel didn't argue. He gave Lorenzo a copy of the receipt. He kept the other one for himself. When they left, he locked the door. He sat down on the floor next to the chest, and sat there until morning. Not because he was afraid of thieves, but because he was thinking. He had to solve 3 problems at once. First, Daniel must find a merchant in Velmar who needs to send money back to Lorenzo. Without that opposite flow, he cannot honor a withdrawal in Velmar, because he holds no gold there. But if a Velmar merchant needs to pay someone in Lorenzo, Daniel can close the loop. Moretti's gold stays in Lorenzo, while the Velmar merchant's gold stays safely in Velmar. Both parties receive receipts, and no physical treasure ever needs to cross the road. In the 21st century, it happens every second. Here, it was a revolution. The second challenge, security. A tavern's basement is no vault. Any determined person with a crowbar in 10 minutes could take everything. A proper facility was needed. The third challenge, trust. He had no name, no family, no history. He was a stranger in odd clothes. Why should anyone trust him? In the morning, he started with the first challenge. He went out to the market square and began listening. 2 hours later, he knew that the Bernardi trading house from Velmar had a permanent representative in Lorenzo. A certain Thomas Bernardi was sitting in an office by the port, waiting for a ship carrying fabrics. Daniel also learns Bernardi must send payment for wool to Velmar, but cannot find enough guards for the caravan. All the mercenaries were either busy or had demanded triple their usual rate following the Moretti robbery. Daniel went to see Bernardi. The office was small. It smelled of wax and ink. Thomas Bernardi turned out to be a burly man with a good-natured face and fidgety hands. He listened to Daniel with an expression that shifted from boredom to interest and from interest to suspicion. When Daniel finished explaining, Bernardi asked one question. He asked what guarantee there was that the receipt wasn't just a piece of blank paper. Daniel replied simply. He offered Bernardi a way to verify it. Bernardi leaves his gold here in Lorenzo. He gives it to Daniel. He receives a receipt. He sends a letter by regular mail to his brother in Velmar. His brother goes to Moretti. Moretti confirms that Bernardi's gold is in the vault. The brother gives Moretti the receipt and receives the same amount from Moretti's Velmar reserves. Everyone is satisfied. No one transported anything. Bernardi remained silent. Then he said that Moretti wouldn't pay him. Daniel said he would pay because Moretti would also receive a receipt from Bernardi for the corresponding amount. And when he needed money in Velmar, he would present it to Bernardi's brother. Bernardi remained silent even longer. Then he said that the whole thing sounded like a scam, but a scam that made sense. He agreed to give it a try. One small sum, 30 silver crowns. If it worked, he'd bring more. Daniel returned to Moretti with the news. Moretti listened. His face was somber. Then he asked why Daniel couldn't just steal both chests and run away. Daniel replied that he could, but then he'd steal 200 coins and lose the chance to earn 200,000. For the first time during the conversation, Moretti smiled. He said that Daniel was thinking like a merchant. Daniel said he was thinking like a banker. Moretti asked what a banker was. Daniel says that soon all of Lorenzo will know. 2 days later, the first counter transaction succeeds. The letter reached Velmar in 4 days. Bernardi's brother came to the Moretti house. He presented the receipt. Moretti handed over 30 crowns from his Velmar reserve. Everything fell into place. Bernardi and Lorenzo received confirmation from his brother and brought another 50 crowns. Then he brought along an acquaintance, a merchant named Ronaldo, who traded spices between Lorenzo and Port Salina. Ronaldo was cautious. He gave 20 crowns. Daniel wrote everything down. Every coin, every name, every date. He kept records using the double entry system. Every transaction was recorded twice. An income here was an expense there. The sum of all entries always equaled 0. If it didn't, it meant an error or theft. This system had existed in his world since the 14th century. Here no one knew about it. Daniel wrote in a thick notebook he'd bought for 3 copper coins. He wrote in small handwriting. He wrote neatly. Every evening he checked the totals. He had replaced the lock on the cellar door. He bought a heavy one with 2 keys. He wore one around his neck. He gave the second one to Moretti. The door wouldn't open without both keys. Moretti says this is not how business is done, and Daniel calmly replies that it is now. It was the end of the 2nd week. He has 4 clients, 120 crowns from Moretti, 80 from Bernardi, and 20 from Ronaldo. 10 crowns came from Torvald, a fur trader who had heard about the new service at the tavern. 230 silver crowns in the basement. 4 receipts in circulation and 1 notebook with double entry records. Daniel lay on a straw mattress in the room above the basement, staring at the ceiling. He thought about how at J.P. Morgan, transactions worth 3 billion a day passed through his hands. And here, he was rejoicing over 230 silver coins like a child. And he was truly rejoicing, because up there he was just a cog in the machine. But here he was, building the machine from scratch, and every cog was his. The pass in his pocket felt warm again. Daniel had already gotten used to it. He didn't know why this thing got warm, but every time it did, his decisions turned out to be right. Maybe it was a coincidence, maybe not. By the 3rd week, Daniel realized that the basement was going to kill him. Not figuratively, literally. One morning, the tavern owner casually mentions that someone has been tampering with the lock on the cellar door. They hadn't broken it open, but they'd been fiddling with it. The innkeeper said this calmly, as if he were reporting the weather. In this town, an attempt to pick someone else's lock was about as big a deal as a light rain. Daniel finished his porridge. He stood up. He went downstairs. He examined the lock. The scratches on the keyhole were fresh. Someone had tried to pick the lock during the night, with 230 silver crowns waiting behind it. For Daniel, these were his first savings. For some people in this city, that was a fortune, enough to live on for a year. He needed a real vault, not a tavern basement with a single lock. A stone building, thick walls, a proper door, and proper security. The problem was that he didn't have the money for it. A 2% commission from 4 clients didn't even cover his food. He went to see Moretti, sat down across from him, got straight to the point. He needed a space, a stone one, in a good location with the potential to be converted into a vault, and he needed money for it. Moretti asks the price, and Daniel names an amount large enough to make him grimace. It was a lot. Daniel said it was an investment. Moretti would become a co-owner of the bank. 10% of the profits for life. Moretti asked what a bank was. Daniel explained. A place where people bring gold for safekeeping and receive receipts. A place where merchants transfer money between cities without caravans. A place where you can take out a loan at a reasonable interest rate instead of the 50% charged by the order of the scales. Moretti looked at him for a long time. Then he said that just the mention of the order of the scales made his eye twitch. His late brother had given 3/4 of his estate to the order over the course of 10 years, and yet, he still died in debt. Moretti agreed. He knew the building, the former office of the Weapons Guild on Blacksmith Street, 2 stories, stone. It had been vacant for half a year. The owner would sell it for a reasonable price because the city was in a crisis and there were no buyers. 3 days later, Daniel was standing inside that building. Dust, cobwebs, the smell of dampness. The first floor was a spacious hall with a stone floor. The second floor was divided into 4 rooms. The basement was deep and dry. Daniel looked at the basement and saw a storage facility, but he didn't see it the way a medieval person would have. A medieval person would have seen a thick door and sturdy walls. Daniel saw a system. He needed a builder, not a mason, but a builder who knew how to think. Moretti says he knows someone, or rather a woman, Greta Olson, a northerner and a mason's widow. She'd inherited her husband's crew, but no one wants to hire a woman for serious work. She gets by on small jobs. Daniel asked for her to be brought in. Greta Olson arrived the next day. Daniel wasn't expecting what he saw. She was tall, almost as tall as he was. Her red hair was tucked under a headscarf, broad shoulders, calloused hands, a weather-beaten, stern face. She looked down at Daniel and asked what he wanted. Her voice was low. Daniel began to explain, not what to build, but why. He said that the vault wasn't protected by the thickness of its walls. Walls could be breached. A door could be broken down. The vault was protected by procedure. He began to list the details. 2 keys held by different people, neither of whom could open it alone. An entry log. Everyone who enters signs in. Security rotation. No guard works 2 nights in a row. The internal layout. The gold is divided into 3 sections. Each has separate access. A robber who breaks through the wall ends up in the first section. 10% of the stock is kept there. By the time he's fiddling with the other doors, security arrives. Ventilation from above. Narrow. A person can't squeeze through, but air flows through. Gold doesn't rust, but people in a sealed basement suffocate. Greta listened. Her expression changed. Her anger faded. Something else took its place. Interest. The genuine, eager interest of a master who had heard a challenge worthy of him. She asked how he knew all this. Daniel said he had worked at a place where a great deal of gold was stored. It was true. The vault of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. He had visited it 3 times during audits, 80 meters underground, with 6,000 metric tons behind a 90 metric ton steel door. He didn't tell Greta about the 90 metric tons. She wouldn't have believed him. Greta was silent for a minute. Then she said she needed 3 weeks and 4 masons, and that she wanted a share of the profits rather than a daily wage. Daniel asked how much. Greta demands 5% from every vault she builds and the right to sign each one like an artist. Greta shook it. Her handshake was firm. Construction began 2 days later. Greta brought 4 men with her. 3 obeyed her without question. The 4th one smirked at first when she gave orders. By the end of the first day, he had stopped smirking. Greta worked side by side with the men. She hauled stones. She mixed mortar. And all the while, she kept the entire blueprint that Daniel had drawn on paper in her head. She even improved upon it. She suggested building a false wall in the basement. Behind it would be an empty space. A burglar would break through the wall and find nothing but empty space. He'd waste time. He'd start to get nervous. A nervous burglar makes mistakes. Daniel approved. It was a principle he knew from working with security systems. Every extra layer of complexity buys time. And time is the one resource a burglar cannot afford. The barrier does not need to be impossible. It only needs to delay him until the guards arrive. While construction was underway, Daniel took on a second task. He needed a clerk. Someone who could count quickly and accurately, and who could be trusted. Moretti recommended a young woman, Hannah Lowe, the daughter of a late lawyer. Her father had gambled away his fortune and died. Her mother had died as well. Hannah lived alone. She earned a living transcribing documents for a notary. No one would hire her. A woman, no connections, no dowry. But she could calculate in her head so quickly that the notary would sometimes just stand there and watch. Daniel found her in a small room above the bakery. She opened the door and looked at him blankly. A thin face, dark hair tied in a tight bun, a black dress, eyes that were attentive and cold. Daniel sat down on the only chair. She remained standing. He offered her a job. She asked what kind. He said he needed someone to keep track of the money. She asked, how much money? He said 230 crowns for now. She raised an eyebrow slightly. That was the minimum. Then he said that in a year, it would be thousands. She raised her other eyebrow. Daniel took out a double entry ledger. He opened it. He showed it to her. He explained the principle. Every transaction is recorded twice, debit and credit. The total is always zero. If it's not zero, it's a mistake. Hannah looked at the page. Her eyes moved quickly from left to right, from top to bottom. She was silent for 30 seconds. Then she points to the third line and identifies a 2-crown error. Daniel checks it. He checked. She was right. He'd made a mistake when recording Ronaldo's transaction. 2 crowns. A trifle, but Hannah had spotted it in 30 seconds. She looked at him, and for the first time, her expression changed. Not a smile, but something close to approval. She said the system was beautiful. Daniel said the system was called double entry bookkeeping, and that it was 600 years old. He didn't specify in which world it was 600 years old. Hannah asked how much it would cost. Daniel named the amount. More than a notary's fee, twice as much. Hannah said she'd start tomorrow. Daniel left. It was raining outside. He walked through the rain toward the building that would become the bank, thinking that he now had a vault being built by a woman whom no one had hired, and a clerk whom no one had valued. 2 people whom this world had cast aside, but to whom he had given a place. The pass in his pocket grows warm, and beneath the rain Daniel hears one precise metallic click, like a brass weight settling onto a scale. When he turns, nothing is there. 18 days later, Greta finishes the vault 3 days early and divides the basement into 3 sections. The false wall is in place. Ventilation is provided through narrow ducts in the ceiling. There are 2 locks on the main door. Daniel and Moretti have the keys. The visitor log lay on the table in the main hall. Everyone who went down to the basement signed it. Time of entry, time of exit, purpose of visit, signature. Greta carved her symbol into the stone above the basement entrance. 3 crossed lines. Her signature. She stood in front of the symbol, tracing it with her fingers, and remained silent. Daniel stood nearby and didn't interfere. He understood what this meant to her. The first piece of work signed with her own name. Not her late husband's name, hers. They carried the gold out of the tavern's basement in a single night. Moretti assigned 2 guards. Greta led the way with a lantern. Hannah carries the ledger and counts 230 crowns by candlelight in the new cellar. Everything matched up. Hannah recorded the transfer in the ledger. Debit the new vault. Credit the old one. Total 0. Daniel looked at her and said she'd picked it up quickly. Hannah replied that the system was logical, and that she picked up logical things quickly. Her voice was steady, but Daniel noticed that she was holding the notebook a little tighter than necessary, like someone who had found something they were afraid of losing. The bank's first day of business in the new building began quietly. Daniel was sitting at a desk on the first floor. Hannah was at the second desk next to him. Moretti stopped by in the morning to check the basement. He made sure everything was in place. Then he left. Outside, in front of the building, hung a sign that Daniel had ordered from a carpenter. A simple board carries the carved words, Bank of Lorenza, and the carpenter asks what a bank is. Daniel explained. The carpenter said it sounded like a pawn shop, only the other way around. Daniel thought about it and agreed that it wasn't a bad description. During the first week in the new building, 3 more customers came in. A leather merchant named Alberto, an elderly woman named Clara, who sold spices at the market, and a young man named Stefano, who was the captain of a river barge and transported cargo between Lorenza and Port Salina. 7 clients in total, 310 crowns in deposits. Daniel realized that this was a paltry sum. The order of the scales dealt in sums of hundreds of thousands, but business was growing slowly, steadily. Each new client came on the recommendation of a previous one. That was more important than any advertising. On the 9th day after the move, what Daniel had both hoped for and feared at the same time happened. A raid. In the morning, 4 people entered the bank, one after another, 10 minutes apart. All 4 were clients. All 4 demanded to take their gold. All of it. Immediately. Ronaldo was the first to arrive. He was nervous. His eyes darted around. He said he'd changed his mind and wanted to take his 20 crowns. Daniel nodded calmly. He asked Hannah to prepare the transaction record. They went down to the basement. Daniel unlocked the first lock. Moretti, who had been summoned by a messenger, unlocked the second. Daniel counted out 20 crowns. Ronaldo counted them over. Everything was in order. He signed the logbook. He took the money. He left. Alberto was the second to arrive. Same story. He took his 40 crowns. Stefano was the third, 30 crowns. Torvald was the fourth to arrive, 10 crowns. In only 2 hours, 100 crowns leave the vault, leaving 210 behind. Moretti stood nearby, his face ashen. He asked Daniel what was going on. Daniel said an audit was underway. Someone had sent these people to collect the money at the same time to see if the bank could handle it or to bring it down. Moretti asked who. Daniel replied that there was only one candidate, the one who stands to gain if people continue to take out loans at 50%. The order of the scales. Moretti turned pale. He knew the order. He knew what they were capable of, but Daniel was calm. He handed everything over, every coin, everyone, without delay, without questions, without trying to persuade them to stay. It was the right decision, and by evening, the entire street knew it. The rumor raced down the shopping street. The Bank of Lorenza had handed over every crown on demand. 4 men came for the gold, and 4 men received the gold instantly. No haggling, no delay. For people who were used to the order of the scales wearing down debtors for months on end, and finding reasons not to return collateral, it was like a slap in the face, in a good way. The next morning Ronaldo arrived. He brought back his 20 crowns. He said he'd acted on impulse, that he'd been advised to take the money, but he'd thought it over and decided that a place that pays out without questions deserves trust. Daniel accepted the deposit. He made a record of it. He didn't ask who had advised him. He already knew. That same day, 2 new clients came in. 3 more arrived 3 days later. By the end of the month, Daniel had 12 clients and 470 crowns in custody. The raid had advertised his business better than any sign. Hannah tallied up the results of the first month. She laid out her notebook in front of Daniel and showed him the numbers. Commission income, expenses for rent and security, salaries, her own, and those of the 2 security hired by Moretti. The total, a loss of 17 crowns. The bank was operating at a loss. Daniel looked at the numbers and said that was normal. Hannah raised an eyebrow. Daniel explains that a new bank can operate at a loss during its first year. At this stage, customer growth matters far more than immediate profit. Every new customer brings more than the coins placed inside the vault. That customer carries the bank story into shops, warehouses, and trading houses. Their receipt becomes visible proof, while their trust spreads through the merchant network. Daniel calls this the network effect, and Hannah immediately asks him to define it. He compares the bank to a fishing net made from countless separate strands. 1 strand is useless, 10 can tear, but 1,000 can hold an enormous catch. Every new strand strengthens all the others, and Hannah records the metaphor word for word. Daniel later saw this note and thought he needed to be more careful with metaphors. They had a way of becoming official terms. By the middle of the second month, what Daniel had been waiting for since day 1 finally happened. The first intracity transfer. Bernardi came to the bank and said he owed Ronaldo 50 crowns for a batch of pepper. Usually, he'd send a servant with a bag of coins halfway across town. Can this be done through the bank? Daniel looked at Hannah. Hannah looked at Daniel. He picked up a pen. He opened his notebook to Bernardi's page. He wrote down 50 crowns. He opened to Ronaldo's page. He wrote down 50 crowns. He closed the notebook. He told Bernardi it was done. Bernardi stood there waiting. Bernardi asks where the gold went, and Daniel answers that it never left the basement. It hadn't moved anywhere. Bernardi now owed 50 crowns less, and Ronaldo owed 50 more. That's it. Bernardi blinked. He blinked again. He turned toward the door. He stopped. He turned back. He asked if he understood correctly that he had just paid 50 crowns without touching them. Daniel confirmed it. Bernardi left the bank. On the street, he ran into Ronaldo, who had come to find out what was going on. They stood in the doorway and looked at each other. Two merchants who had just transferred money with a single line in a notebook. No servants, no bags, no risk of robbery. Ronaldo asked Bernardi how he felt. Bernardi said he felt like a man who had been carrying water in buckets his whole life, and suddenly saw a water pipe. They walked away together in silence, exchanging glances like conspirators. The next morning brought someone different entirely. A woman walked into the bank early in the morning while Hannah was still laying out the ledgers. Young, 22 years old, chestnut hair, warm eyes, well dressed, but not extravagantly. She stopped at the threshold and surveyed the room the way people accustomed to evaluating a space do. A quick glance at the walls, at the desk, at Hannah, at the door to the basement. Then she walked up to the counter and said her name was Amelia Moretti, and that she wanted to open her own account, not her father's, her own. Hannah looked at her. She looked at Daniel. Daniel nodded. Amelia placed a small bag of coins on the table, 35 crowns. She said she'd earned them herself by selling lace at the fair in Port Salina. Without her father's help, Hannah counted the money, recorded the amount, and issued a receipt. Amelia took the receipt and looked at it with an expression Daniel had seen many times before. The look on the faces of people seeing their money written down in black and white for the first time. Not in a chest, not in a sack, on paper with a seal. Officially, Amelia said she wanted to talk to Daniel privately. They sat down at a table in the back room. Amelia spoke quickly and to the point. She said her father had told her about the bank, that she'd been observing from the sidelines for 2 months, that she could see where things were headed. She added that Daniel had a problem he still had not solved. Daniel asked what it was. Amelia said that 12 merchants and 3 market traders knew him. That wasn't enough. There were 400 merchant houses in Lorenza. Most hadn't even heard of the bank, and those who have heard of it don't trust it because Daniel is an outsider. Because he has no connections. Because merchants don't trust pieces of paper. They trust people they know. They trust her. She's Moretti's daughter. She grew up at the market. She knows half the city's merchants by name and remembers the names of their wives and children. She can speak to them in their own language. She can explain why a bank is needed in a way they'll understand, not the way Daniel explains it. He speaks in numbers. Merchants don't like numbers. They like stories. She knows how to tell stories. Daniel listened. She was right on every point. He asked what she wanted. Amelia said she wanted to be a representative of the bank, an official one with signing authority with her own seal. Not her father's assistant, not Moretti's daughter, the face of the bank. Daniel was silent for 10 seconds. Not because he doubted her, but because he was thinking about the consequences. Giving a 22-year-old woman signing authority on financial documents in a world where women weren't allowed into the guilds. That was a challenge. But Daniel remembered something from his own world. The first banks in Renaissance Italy, the Medici, the Bardi, the Peruti, they too had done things that seemed unthinkable. They succeeded not because they followed the rules, but because they set new ones. Daniel accepts Amelia's demand, and she nods like someone receiving exactly what she expected. A week later, Daniel orders a small brass seal engraved with the initials AM and the bank's scales. He handed it to Amelia in the presence of Hannah and Moretti. Amelia took the seal. She turned it over in her hands. She looked at her father. Moretti looked at his daughter, his expression complex, a mix of pride and anxiety. Amelia dipped the seal in ink and stamped it on a blank sheet of paper. She looked at it. Her hands were trembling. She quickly hid them under the table, but Daniel noticed and Hannah noticed. A week after Amelia's appointment at the bank, a man arrived whom Daniel hadn't expected. Tall and thin, with a graying beard, an expensive dark red doublet, a ruby ring, and 2 bodyguards. He didn't enter as a client. He entered like a master, stepping into a servant's room. He stopped in the middle of the hall. He surveyed the walls, the table, Hannah, Daniel, and slowly smiled. He introduced himself as Vittorio Caldani, head of the Order of the Scales in Lorenza and the 3 neighboring provinces. Daniel knew that name. He'd heard it dozens of times over the past 2 months. Always in whispers, always with caution. Kaldani wasn't just a lone shark. He was a system. His men kept a third of the city's merchant houses in debt. His interest rates stifled trade. His collection methods included things people spoke of quietly and not in public. Kaldani approached Daniel's table. He sat down without being invited. He placed his hands on the table. His hands were manicured. His nails were clean. The ring was heavy. He said he'd come to make his acquaintance, that he'd heard some interesting things, that a stranger had appeared in town who was handing out pieces of paper instead of gold. He said this with a smile, a soft, almost friendly one. Daniel knew that smile. He'd seen it dozens of times in meeting rooms in Manhattan. The smile of a man who's already decided you're going to lose, but wants to see how you'll squirm. Daniel didn't squirm. He asked how he could help. Kaldani said he didn't need help. He'd come to warn him in a friendly sort of way. The receipts Daniel issues aren't money. Money is minted by the sovereign. Coins have weight and fineness. A piece of paper has nothing. If merchants start accepting pieces of paper instead of coins, it undermines the mint. Undermining the mint was a crime, not a guild offense, but a state crime. Daniel understood what that meant. Kaldani wasn't making threats himself. He intended to use the law to appeal to the authorities, to declare the receipts counterfeit money, to demand an arrest. In a world without a central bank, and without financial legislation, that was possible. A judge who had never heard the word receipt might well decide that a piece of paper with a seal was a counterfeit coin. Daniel paused. Then he replied. He said that a receipt wasn't money. A receipt was a receipt, an obligation to pay money. Like the promissory notes that the Order of the Scales itself issues every day. Kaldani narrowed his eyes. Daniel continued. He said that if the order's promissory note is legal, then the bank's promissory note is also legal, because they are identical in nature. The only difference is in the interest rates. The order charges 50. The bank charges 2. Kaldani was silent. Then he stood up. He smoothed out his doublet. He looked down at Daniel. He said that Daniel was a smart man, and that smart people in Lorenzo live long lives only if they know how to choose their friends. Then he left. The guards followed him. Silence. Hannah exhaled. She said her hands were cold. Daniel looked at his own. His were too. He hadn't shown it in front of Kaldani, but the fear was real. Kaldani wasn't bluffing. He could appeal to the city council. He could appeal to the Duke of Velmar. He could find a judge who would rule in his favor. He could simply hire men with knives. Daniel stood up and walked over to the window. It was raining outside, he thought. In his world, banks survived because the government backed them. A license, a regulator, the law. None of that existed here. Here, he had 12 clients and 400 crowns in the basement, and a woman with a notebook, and the merchant's daughter with a brass seal. He also had the builder who had signed the vault with her own name. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He turned to Hannah and said they needed to grow faster. When Hannah asks how much faster, Daniel says they need 40 clients before the month ends. Hannah raised an eyebrow and said that meant tripling their client base in a month. Daniel nodded and said that now they had Amelia. Hannah looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. Then she opened her notebook and began to write. Amelia started working that very same day. She left in the morning and returned in the evening. She went from shop to shop, from office to office, from warehouse to warehouse. She spoke with merchants, not about numbers, but about stories. She told them how Bernardi had paid Ronaldo without ever touching the coins. How 4 men had come to collect gold and received everything within an hour. How her father was sleeping peacefully for the first time in a year because his money was locked behind 3 doors instead of under the bed. The merchants listened. Some smiled. Some asked questions. Some came back the next day. By the end of the 3rd month, the bank had 38 clients. Not 40, but close. Daniel didn't complain. He knew that growth was exponential. Every new client accelerated the arrival of the next one. 38 wasn't the end. 38 was the beginning of a curve that in 6 months would turn into an avalanche. He stood on the bank's threshold that evening and looked out onto the street. The city was bustling with evening activity. Merchants were closing their shops. Children were running home. Music was playing somewhere. Daniel thought about Kaldani. I doubt his smile. I doubt his ring. I doubt his words about friends. Then he looked inside the bank. Hannah was sitting at a desk, tallying up the day's figures. Her pen moved quickly and precisely. She didn't look up. She was exactly where she wanted to be. Daniel thought that Kaldani had an army, money, and connections. But he had Hannah Lowe, who could calculate in her head faster than anyone in this city, and Amelia Moretti, who could sell ice to a northerner. Greta Olson could build vaults like fortresses, while his double-entry ledger tied the whole system together. The pass in his pocket was warm. Daniel squeezed it through the fabric. He didn't know who had sent him here. He didn't know why, but he knew he wasn't going to lose. That night someone tried to break into the vault. Not picking the lock like last time, breaking through the wall. Daniel woke up to a loud rumble. He was sleeping on the second floor of the bank, in a small room he'd set up for himself. It was dark. The rumbling was coming from below, from the basement. He grabbed an oil lamp and ran down the stairs. In the main hall stood the night watchman, sword in his hand, his eyes wild. He said someone downstairs was pounding on the wall. Daniel went down to the basement door. The rumbling had stopped. He unlocked the first lock. He waited for Moretti, who had been sent to wake him up. Moretti arrived 20 minutes later in his nightshirt with the key around his neck. They unlocked the second lock. They went inside. First section, the gold was still there. Second section, still there. Third, still there. But there was a fresh crack in the far wall of the basement. Someone was pounding from the outside, from ground level, through the foundation with powerful blows. At least 3 people with pickaxes. They hadn't broken through. Greta had built it solid. The stones were 2 elbows thick, but there was a crack. One more night like that, and they would have reached the false wall. The false wall would have held them back for another hour. Then they would have realized it was empty behind it. They would have gotten angry. They would have started looking for the real passage. They would have found it. They would have had until dawn. That was enough. Daniel stood in front of the crack and thought. Not about the wall, about the system. The wall is the last line of defense. If it came down to the wall, it meant all the previous lines of defense had failed. The guard hadn't noticed the men with the pickaxes, or he had noticed them, but couldn't stop them, or he wasn't outside. He checked. The night shift guard was on duty inside the building. There was no one outside. That was a mistake. His mistake. He'd built defenses from the inside and forgotten about the perimeter. At J.P. Morgan, the perimeter began 3 blocks away from the building. Cameras, sensors, patrols. Here, he had none of that. In the morning, he gathered everyone. Hannah, Moretti, Greta, who had been called in to inspect the wall. Daniel laid out the plan. They needed external security. Not just one person, 3 working in shifts. 1 during the day, 2 at night. 1 at the main entrance, 1 patrolling the perimeter of the building every 15 minutes. Moretti grimaced. He said it was expensive. 3 security guards was an expense that would eat up all the profit, which didn't exist anyway. Daniel agreed, and he suggested an alternative. Don't hire mercenaries from the market. Find one person, a professional who would organize security as a system rather than a mob of men with swords. Moretti asked where to find such a person. Amelia, who was standing in the doorway listening, said she knew. There's a woman living at the market by the harbor, So-Yeon Park, the daughter of a merchant from the Far East. After her father's death, she guarded caravans, but she's been out of work for the past 6 months. No one hires a woman for security, especially a foreigner. Daniel asked for her to be brought in. So-Yeon Park arrived that same afternoon. Daniel saw her, and understood why Amelia had recommended her. She entered silently. That was the first thing he noticed. The door didn't creak. The floorboards didn't groan. She simply appeared in the room. She was short, thin, short black hair, calm face. Her eyes moved slowly, but Daniel could see that they took everything in. She surveyed the hall, the doors, the windows, the arrangement of the tables. She was doing the same thing Daniel had done when he assessed the building. Only she wasn't assessing a storage room. She was assessing a defense space. Daniel began to explain the situation, so Yen listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked 3 questions. How many entry points? What's the view from the roof? Is there an underground exit? Daniel answered the first 2. To the third, he said no. So Yen said they needed one. Daniel looked at Greta. Greta looked at So Yen. The 2 women whom the world had refused to hire stared at each other for 5 seconds. Then Greta said she could dig a tunnel to the neighboring building in 4 days. So Yen nodded. Then she turned to Daniel and laid out her terms. She didn't want a daily wage. She wanted a permanent position, a permanent one with housing provided by the bank. And she wouldn't just guard the building, she would protect it personally. Daniel asked, why? So Yen replied briefly, the building could be rebuilt, gold can be earned again. The man who came up with all this on his own. If he dies, the bank dies with him. So, it's not the walls that need protecting, but his head. Daniel hired her on the spot. So Yen moves into the room beside Daniel's on the 2nd floor. That same evening, all her belongings fit into a single bag, a sword, a short knife, a change of clothes, and a flat wooden box that she didn't open in front of him. She settled in and went out onto the roof. She stood there until dark, looking out at the street, at the neighboring houses, at the alleys. She memorized everything. The next morning, she presented Daniel with the security plan. It was written on a sheet of paper she'd asked Hannah for. Her handwriting was small and precise. Patrol routes, shift schedules, observation points, alarm signals, code knocks, procedure in case of an attack, procedure in case of a fire, procedure in case of poisoning. As Daniel reads, the pass warms again, and 3 soft clicks sound inside his head, evenly spaced like someone testing a measure. So Yen asks what he heard. Daniel says nothing, because the room is silent and the plan in his hands already explains why the pass reacted. Systems, not separate walls and locks, but an interconnected structure where each element supports the other. He needed her not only as a bodyguard, he needed her as someone who understood that security is a process, not an object. He approved the plan. So Yen hired 2 assistants, young guys from the dockside neighborhood, former sailors, strong, obedient. She put them through their paces for 3 days. She taught them to walk quietly, to look in the right way, not at what's moving, but at what should be moving, but isn't. A week later, the bank was secure. Not perfectly, but enough to make a random robber think twice, and to strip a prepared one of the element of surprise. Greta finished the tunnel, a narrow passage from the basement to the basement of the neighboring house. The owner of a neighboring house received payment for renting out the basement and a promise to keep quiet. So Yen checked the tunnel herself. She walked through it 3 times. She times the escape at 2 minutes, meaning Daniel can reach safety in exactly 2 minutes. That was when the 2-minute escape route stopped being theory, because someone finally came for Daniel himself. He was walking home from the market that evening alone. So Yen was at the bank. He hadn't taken her with him because he was just going to buy some bread. Stupid. He realized that when 2 men emerged from the alley quickly, quietly, one in front, one behind. The one in front had a knife. The one behind had a club. The one in front said that if the stranger handed over his wallet, he'd live. Daniel handed over his wallet. It contained 6 copper coins for bread. The one in front looked into the wallet. He spat. He said he'd been told the banker had more money. He'd been told someone had sent them. It wasn't a robbery. It was a warning. The one in the back swung his club. Daniel covered his head with his hands. The blow landed on his ribs. The pain was bright and white. He fell to his knees. A second blow to his back. He lay face down in the mud. They left. They didn't finish him off. A warning. He lay in the alley, breathing in the dirt. His ribs were on fire. His back was on fire. He thought about how, back in New York, the worst thing that had ever happened to him at work was when the server crashed right before the quarterly report. Now, he was being beaten with batons in an alley for daring to give people 2% instead of 50. He got to his feet. He limped over to the bank. So Yen opened the door. She looked at him. Her face hadn't changed, but her eyes were different. She said one word: he wouldn't go out alone anymore ever. Daniel didn't argue. By dawn, the wall still stands, but Daniel understands that the enemy has crossed a line. So Yan's security system now protects the vault, the escape tunnel, and Daniel himself. The beating in the alley leaves bruises, cracked ribs, and a lesson he cannot ignore. The conflict is no longer commercial, because the Order has openly chosen violence. His ribs ached for 2 weeks. Daniel worked with his chest bandaged. Hannah didn't say anything when she saw him that morning after the attack. She simply pulled his chair closer to the table so he wouldn't have to reach. A small gesture, Daniel noticed. Amelia said word had already spread around town. Not about the attack on Daniel, about the fact that the Order of the Scales had declared war on the bank. Not officially, but everyone understood. 2 merchants withdrew their deposits the day after the attack. They were scared. Daniel didn't try to stop them. He gave them everything, just like last time. The rest stayed. 36 clients. Daniel sat at the table and thought. He couldn't respond with force. He had no force. Kaldani had mercenaries, dozens of them. Daniel had So Yan and 2 former sailors. That's no army. But he had something else. Knowledge. He knew that the Order of the Scales operated on a model that was vulnerable. Any monopolistic money lender is vulnerable because their profits depends on a single condition: the client cannot leave. When the client has a choice, the monopoly collapses and the monopolist begins to make mistakes. Years without competition had made Kaldani lazy, and he had forgotten how to think. Daniel decided not to defend himself. He decided to expand faster than Kaldani would have time to react. He called Amelia. He told her they needed not 38 clients, but 100. By the end of the 4th month, Amelia looked at him as if you were crazy. Then she asked, "How?" Daniel orders Amelia to cut the commission to 1% for every new client. After 3 months, the standard 2% fee returns, creating the world's first introductory offer. In his world, banks did this every day. Free credit cards for the first year, 0 transfer fees for the first month. Here, the analogy was simpler. Cheaper than the Order's rates. So much cheaper that it would be foolish to turn it down. Amelia nodded. She left. She got to work. Meanwhile, Daniel did something else. He asked Hannah to prepare the figures. All the figures. How much a typical merchant in Lorenza pays the Order of the Scales per year. How much he loses on caravan security. How much on currency exchange. How much on cargo insurance, total expenses. Hannah calculated for 2 days. The result was staggering. The average Lorenza merchant spends 31% of annual income on financial expenses. Out of every 100 crowns earned, 31 went not toward goods or transportation, but toward interest on loans and insurance against the very risks created by the system itself. Daniel wrote these figures on a large sheet of paper in large letters. He hung it on the bank's wall, outside, where the entire street could see it. Any passerby could stop and read it. At the top of the sheet, large letters. How much do you pay for the fact that money is metal? Below it stands a column of costs, totaling 31 crowns out of every 100 earned. It was the first act of financial transparency in Aaron's history. Public out on the street for everyone. People stopped. They read it. Some counted on their fingers. Some turned pale. One old merchant stood in front of that sign for 15 minutes. Then he went into the bank. But then 2 nights later, Kaldani sent a man to tear the sign down. In the morning, Daniel hung up a new one. Kaldani sent someone again. Daniel hung up a 3rd one. After the 3rd time, Kaldani stopped tearing them down because every time the sheet was torn down, the townspeople discussed it, and every time the discussion favored the bank. The torn down sign was proof that the numbers on it were true. Otherwise, why tear them down? By the end of the 4th month, the bank had 67 customers, not 100. But growth was accelerating. But then something more important than customer growth walked through the door. A merchant named Marco Duca came to Daniel with an unusual request. He said he traded in fabrics between Lorenza and Port Salina. He needed a loan, not from the Order, but from the bank, at a reasonable interest rate. Daniel had been waiting for this moment. the first loan application. But he couldn't grant a loan the way the order did. The order treated everyone the same, 50%, because the order didn't know how to assess risk. To the order, every borrower was equally unreliable. Daniel knew how to assess risk, 10 years of experience. He sat down with Duca and asked him 20 questions. What goods? What route? How many times a year? What were the losses over the last 3 years? Are there any regular customers in Port Salina? What was the volume of the last shipment? How much was the warehouse rent? Duca answered. At first, he was surprised. Then he became interested. No one had ever asked him about his business in such detail. The order of the scales didn't ask anything. The order gave money and waited for repayment with interest. If the borrower didn't repay, they seized the collateral. Simple, cruel, effective for the order, ruinous for the merchant. Daniel listened to all the answers. He did the math. Duca was a reliable borrower, a stable business, regular clients, moderate expenses. The risk of default was low. Daniel gave him a loan at 9% per year. Duca sat there speechless. Then he asked if he'd heard correctly. 9, not 50. 9. Daniel confirmed it and explained why. Duca qualified for 9% because his stable business made him a reliable borrower. For an unreliable borrower, the interest rate would be higher. For a very unreliable one, Daniel would have refused the loan altogether. This was something Aaron had never seen before. A personalized rate, an assessment based not on the principle that everyone is the same, but on the principle that everyone is different. Duca left with the money and signed a stack of documents that seemed excessive to him. The loan agreement, the payment schedule, the description of the collateral, the terms for early repayment, the late payment penalty. Every clause was explained. Every number was on paper. Duca said that the contract with the order of the scales fit into 3 lines. Daniel replied that it was easy to hide a trap in 3 lines. In 30 lines, the traps are obvious. Duca told 3 acquaintances about it that same evening. A week later, 2 more people came asking for loans. Daniel assessed each one. He gave one a loan at 11%. He turned down the second one. The second man was unreliable. 3 consecutive unsuccessful trading seasons, debts to 2 private lenders, and unrealistic plans. Daniel explained to him why he'd refused. Not rudely, calmly, with figures. He said that if this man came back in 6 months with better results, the bank would reconsider its decision. The man left angry. But a month later, Daniel learned that this same man was telling people at the market that the bank had turned him down and explained why. He also told them it was the first honest rejection he had ever received. Instead of another door slammed in his face. Even the rejection worked in the bank's favor, because an honest explanation showed respect, and respect in this world was scarcer than gold. In the 5th month, a widow came to the bank. Daniel remembered that day down to the last detail. Morning, rain outside the window. Hannah was at the desk checking yesterday's records. So Yan was standing by the door. The door opened. A woman of about 35, thin. Her hands were red from work. Her dress was mended in 4 places, a scarf on her head. She stopped in the doorway and looked into the lobby. The way people look when they've come to a place where they have no business being, but have come anyway. So Yen looked at her and stepped back slightly from the door. Not a word, just a gesture. A wordless invitation to enter. The woman stepped inside. She walked up to the counter. She placed 2 coins on the table. Copper coins, the smallest denomination in Lorenza. With these 2 coins, you could buy a loaf of bread and a piece of cheese. She said her husband had been a blacksmith. He died 4 months ago. Fever. The smithy is closed. The tools lie idle. She has 3 children. The oldest is 10. She works as a laundress. She can't afford to lose these 2 coins, but she had heard that money is safe in a bank, and she wants to know if the bank will keep them safe. Anna sat motionless. The pen froze in her hand. Daniel looked at the 2 copper coins on the counter and felt something stirring inside him. At J.P. Morgan, the minimum private client deposit was $250,000. And standing before him was a woman with 2 coins worth less than a cup of coffee in Manhattan. And she was asking if he would keep them safe. He didn't accept the coins as a deposit. He did something else. He asked the woman to sit down. She sat down warily, ready to get up and leave at any moment. He asked about the blacksmith shop, where it was, what kind of equipment they had, what kind of tools, what her husband did, who he sold to. The woman's name was Mary, Mary Winter. Her husband forged nails and hinges for doors and shutters. Simple work, but steady. The town always needed nails. It always needed hinges. The blacksmith shop was on the outskirts. The forge was still there. The anvil was still there. The tools were intact. The only things missing were a blacksmith and money for coal and metal. Daniel ran the numbers in his head. The cost of coal, the cost of iron billets, rent, the apprentices' wages. He asked Mary if she knew how to work with iron. Mary said she'd helped her husband for 12 years. She hadn't done any forging herself, but she knew the process. She blew the bellows. She fed the billets into the forge. She tempered the finished pieces. Daniel asked if she could learn to forge on her own. Mary was silent. Then she said she didn't know. Daniel took out a sheet of paper. He drew up a table. Expenses, income, monthly. He showed it to her. If he hired one apprentice and bought coal and raw materials for 3 months, then in 3 months, the forge would start turning a profit. In 6 months, it would reach a point where Mary could feed the children and pay the apprentice. In a year, she'd pay back the loan. In 2 years, he'd hire a second apprentice. Mary looked at the table. She didn't understand all the numbers, but she understood the general trend. The numbers were going up. Daniel offers an interest-free 1-year loan, secured by Mary's tools, enough to restart the blacksmith shop. Mary looked up at him. There was fear in her eyes, not distrust. Fear. The fear of someone to whom a hand is being extended, and who fears that the hand might turn out to be a trap. In her world, every extended hand had concealed a trap, so she asked, why? Why? For free. What would he get out of it? Daniel answered. He said it wasn't charity, it was an investment. Once the blacksmith shop was up and running, Mary would open a bank account. Her apprentices would open accounts. Her suppliers would open accounts. Every functioning business in town makes the bank stronger. Every craftsman who goes bankrupt makes the bank weaker. Helping her is profitable, not out of kindness, out of arithmetic. He said it that way because he knew. If he said it was out of kindness, she wouldn't believe him. If he said it was out of arithmetic, she would believe him, because you can't fake arithmetic. Mary picked up a quill. She signed the contract. Her hand was shaking, but her signature was firm. She took 2 copper coins from the table. Daniel didn't take them. She left in silence. She didn't say thank you. She didn't cry. She just left. So-Yen opened the door for her. Mary walked past without looking up. So-Yen closed the door and looked at Daniel. She didn't say anything, but her gaze was different. Hannah was silent. Then she said quietly that they needed to start a separate ledger for such loans. Hannah proposes a separate ledger for loans meant to restore livelihoods rather than maximize profit. Hannah wrote it down in the margins in small handwriting. Restoration Fund, another term that would become official. Within a week, half of Lorenza knew the story of the blacksmith's widow. Daniel didn't tell anyone. Mary didn't tell anyone. But in a small town, stories take on a life of their own. Someone saw Mary leaving the bank. Someone saw her buying coal at the market the next day. Someone saw smoke coming from the blacksmith's chimney a week later for the first time in 4 months. People drew their own conclusions. The bank had helped the widow. Not the order, not the guild, not the town council. The bank, a stranger with papers. A different sort of crowd began to visit Daniel. Not merchants, artisans. A shoemaker whose workshop roof had sprung a leak. A weaver whose loom had broken. A baker who needed a new oven. Ordinary people with small sums. Daniel couldn't help everyone. The bank didn't have that much spare capital, but he helped 4 of them. 4 interest-free loans secured by tools. 4 recovery plans sketched out on paper with numbers. 4 handshakes. Hannah kept a separate ledger, the recovery fund. 4 entries, 4 names, for stories. She kept it more meticulously than the main ledger. Daniel noticed this and said nothing. In the 6th month, Daniel made a decision that changed the entire scope of things. He announced that he was opening a branch in Velmar. Moretti said it was madness. Velmar is a different country, different laws, different rules, and the order of the scales is stronger there than in Lorenza. Daniel said that was exactly why they needed to go to Velmar. As long as the receipt is valid only in Lorenza, it's just a piece of paper. When the receipt is valid in 2 cities, it's a tool. When it's valid in 3, it's currency. Moretti said Daniel had no connections in Velmar. No office space, no people. Daniel said he does have connections. Bernardi, his brother in Velmar, is already working with the bank's receipts. Bernardi's brother already uses the receipts in Velmar and can become the branch's first client. She knows how they build up there, and he'll find people there. Moretti fell silent. Then he asked who Daniel would leave behind in Lorenza. Daniel looked at Hannah. Hannah looked up from her notebook. Their eyes met. She nodded. Just a nod. Moretti saw that nod and realized the decision had already been made. Hannah would stay in charge. Daniel would go to Velmar with So-Yan, with Greta, and with Amelia, who would represent the bank in the new city. The journey to Velmar took 5 days on horseback. It was Daniel's first time riding. He hated horses, and the horses seemed to hate him just as much. So-Yan rode beside him in silence. Her silence was special, not heavy, not empty, but present. She was silent, yet she was there, like a wall that doesn't speak, but behind which one feels safe. Greta rode ahead, cursing at the bumps in the road. Amelia rode behind, chatting with the mule driver, who was carrying their belongings. 10 minutes later, the mule driver was laughing. 20 minutes later, he was telling her about his mother-in-law. An hour later, Amelia knew the names of all his children and the routes of the 3 caravan trails he considered safe. Daniel watched her and thought he'd hired the right person. Amelia gathered information not as a spy, but as a friend. People voluntarily gave her what they would have hidden from anyone else. It was a gift. They arrived in Velmar on the 5th day. The city was larger than Lorenza, more imposing, stone walls, 3 men tall, towers with flags, guards, and identical armor bearing a coat of arms. It was a duchy, not a republic. There was a ruler here, the Duke of Velmar, and there were rules here that didn't exist in free Lorenza. The first thing Daniel did was find Bernardi's brother. Enrico Bernardi turned out to be a man completely unlike his brother. Thin, nervous, with quick eyes, and a habit of rubbing his hands together. He met Daniel in his office near the market square. He listened. His first question was about money. How much Daniel was willing to invest in the Velmar branch. Daniel named a figure, and Enrico grimaced. Not enough. Velmar isn't Lorenza. Prices are higher here. Rent is more expensive. Opening a new trading establishment also required permission from the Guild Council, which was controlled by 3 families. One of them is connected to the Order of the Scales. Daniel asked, which 2 others? Enrico names the Salvini Arms Trading House and the Westergaard Grain Trading House. The Salvinis were neutral. The Westergaards were up to their ears in debt to the Order. That meant that out of 3 votes, 1 was automatically against them, 1 was in debt and dependent, 1 was neutral. Daniel decided to start with the Salvinis. Amelia went to see them that same day. She returned in the evening. Her expression was serious. She said that the head of the Salvini house was an old man named Riccardo. He listened to her. He was polite. He offered her some wine, and he said he couldn't support the bank until he understood what it was and why he needed it. Daniel said he would go see him himself tomorrow. So-Yan said she would go with him. Daniel nodded. He no longer argued with her about this. The Salvini house was a mansion on a hill in the upper part of the city, stone, old, with a coat of arms on the gate, 2 crossed swords. Riccardo Salvini received them in a hall with tapestries and a fireplace. He was in his 70s. His face was wrinkled and sharp. His eyes were clear. He sat in an armchair with a glass of wine and looked at Daniel with a curiosity that was almost scientific, as if he were studying a new species of animal. He said he'd heard about the bank in Lorenza. Paper instead of gold. Interesting. And he asked the question Daniel had heard 100 times before. What's to stop a banker from simply stealing the gold and running away? Daniel answered the same way he always did. Nothing. Except that stealing 200 coins is foolish when you can earn 200,000. Salvini smirked. He said that was the answer of a merchant, not a banker. A merchant calculates profit. A banker calculates risk. Salvini asks what happens if the Duke simply demands every deposit in the Velmar vault. It was a good question, the best one he'd been asked in 6 months. In Lorenza, there was no Duke. There was a republic, a council of merchants. No one could give orders here. The Duke could take everything away with a single decree. Daniel thought for 30 seconds. Then he answered. He said the Duke wouldn't take it away, because he couldn't, because he wouldn't want to. Within a year, the Duke would need money for the army, the walls, or some other emergency, and then he would have only 2 options. Turn to the Order of the Scales for 50%, or to the bank at 10%. A Duke who bankrupts a bank cuts off the hand he'll use to eat with tomorrow. Salvini looked at him for a long time. Then he said that this was either brilliant or presumptuous, and that he couldn't tell one from the other, but he liked it. He would vote in favor of granting permission on one condition. The Salvini house would receive the right to the first loan upon opening a branch at that very 10% rate. Daniel held out his hand. Salvini shook it. The old man's handshake was unexpectedly firm. That left Westergaard. Amelia had found out that the head of the house, Jacob Westergaard, owed the Order of the Scales 800 crowns, a huge sum. At a rate of 50%, he was paying 400 crowns a year in interest alone. His grain business brought in 300 crowns. He was sinking slowly, deeper every year. A classic debt trap. Daniel knew people like that. In New York, they'd go to the bank for refinancing. You take out a new loan at a lower interest rate and pay off the old one. A simple transaction. Here, it was impossible because there was no second lender. The order was the only one until today. Daniel went to see Westergaard in person. Jacob Westergaard turned out to be a heavy-set man with frightened eyes. He was sitting in an office cluttered with papers, and looked like a man who hadn't slept in a long time. Daniel offered him a deal. The bank would buy out his debt from the Order of the Scales. It would pay the order the full amount. Westergaard would now owe the bank, but not at 50% interest, at 12%. His annual payment would drop from 400 crowns to 96, a difference of 300 crowns a year. In exchange for that relief, Westergaard would vote for the branch license and become a client of the bank. Westergaard looked at Daniel like a man who'd been handed a lifeline just as he was drowning. He asked why. Daniel answered the same way he'd answered Mary Winter. Arithmetic. A living Westergaard with a functioning business is more useful than a dead Westergaard with an empty warehouse. Westergaard signed that very same day. The Guild Council voted 2-1 in favor of the permit. Greta found the building, a former warehouse by the northern gate, stone, sturdy. She said it would be a storage facility in 3 weeks, better than the one in Lorenza, because now she knows what to build. Daniel stood in the empty hall of the future Velmar branch and looked out the window at the city. The pass in his pocket was hot. Not warm, hot. He took it out. The plastic burned his fingers. The bank's logo, his photograph, a magnetic strip on the back, a thing from another world, the only proof that that world had existed. Daniel clenched the pass and held it to his temple. He closed his eyes. For a second, he thought he heard a sound, quiet, distant, as if someone were counting. Not words, numbers, a rhythmic muttering of numbers. He opened his eyes. The sound was gone. The pass had cooled. The branch in Velmar opened 26 days after their arrival. Greta had outdone herself. The vault was better than the one in Lorenza. 4 sections instead of 3. A double false wall. A tunnel to the neighboring building with 2 turns, so that a pursuer would lose time at each one. She signed the stone above the entrance with her symbol, 3 crossed lines. She looked at Daniel and said that this was the second one. There would be more. The first client of the Velmar branch was Riccardo Salvini, just as promised. He came with his grandson. The young man, about 20 years old, was carrying a chest. Inside were 300 crowns. Salvini placed the money on the counter and said he wanted to see how the system worked. Amelia accepted the deposit. She wrote out a receipt. Salvini took it. He turned it over in his hands. He sniffed it. Then he asked whether sending this piece of paper to Lorenza would release 300 crowns there. Daniel confirmed it. Salvini looked at the paper, then at Daniel, then back at the paper. He said quietly that he was holding in his hands something lighter than a feather, but worth more than a sword. The old man had seen many wonders, but he had never seen anything like this. The Velmar branch gains 11 customers in its first week, surpassing Lorenza's opening week. The bank's name was already making a name for itself. Rumors spread faster at caravans. But along with the rumors came what Daniel had been waiting for. On the branch's third day of operation, a man in a gray cloak entered the building. Short, unremarkable, he approached the counter and asked to open an account. Amelia began taking down his details. The man gave his name. He placed some coins on the counter, 10 crowns. He received a receipt. He left. So Yen stood by the door and watched him go. Then she approached Daniel and said quietly that this man wasn't a merchant. Daniel asked how she knew. So Yen said that merchants count their coins. This one didn't. Merchants check the receipt. This one didn't. Merchants ask about the terms. This one didn't. He didn't come for a service. He came to look inside. So Yan was right. 2 days later, the same man returned and took back his 10 crowns. A day later, fresh scratches were discovered on the vault door. Someone had been studying the lock. The order of the scales wouldn't leave Daniel alone. They'd simply moved to a different city. Daniel gathered everyone that evening, so Yan, Amelia, and Greta, who hadn't left yet. He said he was expecting an attack. Not a random one, but an organized one. The order was stronger in Velmar than in Lorenza. They had more people and more money. The bank also lacked the reputation Daniel had spent half a year building in Lorenza. Here they're outsiders again. So Yan proposed a plan. She said the attack would happen at night, always at night. She would beef up security. 3 guards on duty instead of 2. A signal rope between the posts. Pull the rope and a bell rings at the other end of the building. Greta suggested adding an iron grate to the tunnel so it couldn't be used to break in from the outside, only for evacuation from the inside. Only so Yan has the key to the grate. Daniel approves both suggestions and adds his own. He suggested dividing up the gold, not keeping it all in one place. 50% in the bank vault, 30% in the basement of the Salvini house, 20% at Bernardi's office. 3 storage locations, 3 keys, 3 receipts for each batch. Even if the vault were robbed, the thieves would only get half. The bank would survive. The clients would get their share. Amelia asked why Salvini and Bernardi would agree to store someone else's gold on their premises. Daniel replied that they would be paid for storage, 0.5% of the total amount per year, money for letting their basement sit empty. It was an idea that in his world was called a correspondent bank. Here, it looked like a trick. Salvini agreed right away. Bernardi haggled for an hour and agreed as well. The gold was moved in a single night, quietly. So Yan personally led 2 men carrying 3 sacks through the night streets of Velmar. The attack happened 4 days later at night, just as So Yan had predicted. 6 of them professionals, not city thugs, but hired fighters. They came from the direction of the backyard. 1 climbed onto the roof. 2 worked on the lock of the back door. 3 stood on the lookout. The signal cord was triggered when the first of the attackers yanked on the back door. A bell rang inside the building. So Yan was already on her feet. She hadn't been sleeping. She said later that she'd had a feeling. The night had felt off. Too quiet leading up to this. 2 guards came out to the back door, one with a sword, the other with a baton and a lantern. The lantern blinded the 2 men at the door. They retreated. So Yen went onto the roof and clashed with the attacker climbing down from above. A brief skirmish. Daniel heard noises from the roof. A thud, a screech. Silence. So Yen returned a minute later. There was a cut on her arm. It wasn't deep, she said. The man on the roof had left. She hadn't killed him. She hadn't wanted to kill him. The attackers had retreated, all 6 of them, quickly and in an organized manner. Professionals. They hadn't achieved their goal, but they hadn't been caught either. In the morning, Daniel inspected the back door. The lock was damaged. Another 5 minutes and they would have broken in. Daniel looked at So-Yan. She was bandagging her hand calmly, as if she were mending clothes rather than treating a wound sustained in battle. Daniel thanked her. So-Yan looked at him for the first time. He saw something other than calmness in her eyes. Something gentle, fleeting, like a flash. She nodded, just once. Then she turned away and went to change the lock on the back door. But the attack wasn't the main event of that week. The main event was the first distance receipt. A merchant from Lorenza named Giacomo arrived in Velmar with a single sheet of paper, just one. No trunk, no guards, no caravan. He walked into the bank branch and placed the receipt on the counter. Amelia checked the signature. She checked the seal. She sends a verification request to Lorenza by carrier pigeon, and Hannah's confirmation arrives 3 days later. The receipt was genuine. The amount was in the account in Lorenza. Amelia handed Giacomo 200 silver crowns from the Velmar vault. Giacomo stood in the middle of the hall, holding a bag of coins. He stood there for a minute, maybe two. He had come from another city with the scrap of paper and received 200 silver crowns. No risk, no guards, no fear. A 5-day journey with a light bag instead of a 5-day journey with an armed caravan. He set the bag on the table. He sat down on a chair. He rubbed his eyes, and he said quietly that he'd spent his whole life transporting gold through the forests, praying he wouldn't get killed. But now, he traveled with just a piece of paper and slept like a baby. Amelia smiled. She said she could draw up a return receipt for him for the proceeds from the sale of the goods in Velmar. That return receipt would let him travel back with paper instead of gold. Giacomo laughed. It was the first time he'd laughed during the entire conversation. He said his wife would stop crying every time he left. He signed the promissory note and left. The news that a merchant from Lorenza had received gold in Velmar based on a piece of paper spread within 2 days. It was something the world of Aaron had never seen before. Money moved without physical transport. Value traveled faster than metal. Paper became more valuable than silver because paper weighed nothing, while silver weighed so much that armed men were needed to carry it. Over the next 2 weeks, 30 new clients came to the Velmar branch. The Lorenza branch, managed by Hannah, took on 20. The bank now serves more than 120 clients and safeguards over 4,000 crowns. Daniel sat in his office in Velmar and read Hannah's report. She wrote in small, even handwriting. The figures were flawless. Every transaction was in order. Every balance had been reconciled. Debits equaled credits. The total was 0. Hannah had run the bank in his absence as if he had never left. No, better. Because Hannah didn't make the little mistakes Daniel did. She didn't make any mistakes at all. He set the report on the desk. He looked out the window. The sun was setting over the rooftops of Velmar. Somewhere below, Amelia was closing up the hall. Somewhere on the roof, a security guard was standing. Somewhere in the tunnel, So-Yan was checking the grate. Somewhere in Lorenza, Hannah was closing her notebook. Somewhere on the outskirts of Lorenza, smoke was rising from the chimney of Mary Winter's blacksmith shop. Daniel thought that 6 months ago, he had been lying in a cart with a bow. And now, he had a bank into cities, 120 clients, 4,000 crowns, 5 people he trusts, and 1 enemy who has no intention of stopping. The pass in his pocket warms, and a whisper of numbers brushes the edge of his hearing before vanishing beneath the evening noise. Daniel clutches it. For the first time, he wonders whether the warmth is not approving his choices, but measuring them. Building a bank was one thing. Understanding why he was building it was another. The 7th month began with the pigeon-carried message from Lorenza. Hannah's handwriting, small, neat, but Daniel noticed that the letters were slightly slanted to the left. Hannah wrote with her left hand only when her right was occupied, or when she was in a hurry. She was in a hurry. The letter contained 3 points. First, the Order of the Scales had filed a complaint with the Lorenza Council, an official one with seals. They demanded that the bank be prohibited from issuing receipts on the grounds that the receipts were replacing coins and undermining the right to mint currency. Second, 2 council members had already endorsed the complaint. Both were debtors to the order. Third, the council meeting is in 12 days. If the council votes for the ban, the bank in Lorenza will close, and with it, the Velmar branch, because without its Lorenza base. Without Lorenza as its base, the Velmar branch will hang in the air, leaving 120 clients exposed. 4,000 crowns will turn into someone else's gold that must be returned. It will all be over. Daniel read the letter twice. Then he folded it. Then he unfolded it and read it a third time. So Yan stood nearby and waited. She saw his face. She didn't ask any questions. She just waited. Daniel said he needed to return to Lorenza immediately, so Yan nodded. He left Amelia in charge of the Velmar branch. She was ready. He knew that. She knew it. Greta stayed in Velmar to finish building the second line of fortifications. Daniel and So Yan set out at dawn. It was a 5-day journey. Daniel hated horses even more than he had the first time. The ribs that had healed after the attack in the alley were aching again from the jostling. On the 3rd day of the journey, he began to think about strategy. But then Daniel saw Kaldani's real weapon, a legal attack far more dangerous than hired blades. Robbers and murderers created a victim. A victim evoked sympathy. A legal attack created a criminal. A criminal evoked fear. If the council declared the receipts illegal, every bank customer would become an accomplice. No one would want to keep a piece of paper that had been declared illegal. It wasn't enough to simply defend himself before the council. He had to make the ban impossible. Not legally, politically. On the 4th day of the journey, he came up with a plan. They arrived in Lorenza on the evening of the 5th day. Hannah was waiting at the bank. She had lost weight. The dark circles under her eyes were deeper than usual, but the notebook was there. The records were flawless. The balance sheet was in order. Daniel looked at her and said she was keeping everything in order better than he could. Hannah replied that it was arithmetic, not a compliment, but the corner of her mouth twitched. The next morning, Daniel sprang into action. He sent a pigeon to Amelia in Velmar with instructions. Then he went to Moretti, then to Bernardi, then to Duca, then to Ronaldo, then to Stefano, to all the key clients. He asked each one the same question. How much have you saved in the 6 months you've been working with the bank? Not an estimate, the exact figure. The merchants did the math. Some took a long time, some were quick. Moretti calculated for half an hour and turned pale. In 6 months, he had saved more than he had earned in the previous year. He saved that money by avoiding caravan security costs and currency exchange losses. He didn't pay interest to the order. Bernardi had saved less, but still a significant amount. Duca, with his 9% loan, had already paid back a third of his debt and expanded his trade. Ronaldo ended the season in the black for the first time in 3 years. Daniel gathered all the figures. He asked Hannah to compile them into a single table. The total amount saved by the bank's clients over half a year. Hannah spent the entire evening calculating. Hannah's calculation shows that the bank's clients saved more than 2,000 crowns in only half a year. 2,000 crowns that remained in the merchants' pockets, instead of going into the order of the scales coffers. 2,000 crowns that were spent on goods, raw materials, salaries, and rent. 2,000 crowns that were circulating in the economy of Lorenza instead of sitting in Kaldani's chests. Daniel wrote these figures on a large sheet in enormous letters, then carried it into the council meeting. The Lorenza council chamber was a stone semicircle with wooden benches, 12 councillors, merchants, and guildmasters. The council chairman was an old moneylender named Olivero. About 50 townspeople fill the public gallery. Kaldani sat in the front row, wearing a red doublet and a ring, with 2 assistants holding papers beside him. He looked calm, confident. He was used to winning in these halls. Kaldani spoke first. He spoke well, articulately, and persuasively. He said that the bank's receipts were counterfeit money, that they were undermining the mint, that a stranger with no name or lineage was handing out scraps of paper and calling them money, that if this were allowed, tomorrow every vagrant would be drawing up pieces of paper and buying bread with them. That order demanded that money be metal of a specific fineness and weight, not ink on parchment. The counselors listened, some nodded. Then Daniel stood up. He did not argue with Kaldani. Instead, Daniel chose a different battlefield. The numbers every merchant in the chamber understood. He walked over to the blackboard, standing in the corner of the hall. He picked up a piece of chalk and began to write. Numbers, only numbers. How much the average merchant in Lorenza pays per year for caravan security. How much he loses on currency exchange. How much interest he pays to the order of the scales. Total 31 crowns out of 100. Then he wrote a second column. How much does a bank customer pay? 2% commission, 0 for security, and 0 for currency exchange. The total is 2 crowns out of every 100, leaving a difference of 29 crowns. He turned toward the hall. Silence, he said, that those 29 crowns don't disappear. They stay in Lorenza, in the merchants' pockets, in the artisans' workshops, in the merchants' shops. Every crown saved on interest becomes a crown spent on goods, workers, food, and the life of the city. He said that in 6 months, the bank's clients had saved 2,000 crowns, money that used to go to the order. Now, that money works inside Lorenza instead of feeding Kaldani's coffers. The silence took on a different quality, a heavy silence. The counselors looked at the board, then at Kaldani. Kaldani stood up. His face was stony. He said that the figures could be faked. Daniel replied that anyone could verify the figures. Let the council appoint an auditor. Let him come to the bank, open the ledger, count it himself. Every entry is in place. Every coin is accounted for inside the vault. He invited the council to inspect the vault in person right now. Kaldani said it was a circus. Chairman Olivero raised his hand. Silence. He said the board would vote. It was an open vote. 9 against the ban, 3 in favor. The Bank of Lorenza remained legal. Kaldani walked out of the room without looking back. He stopped at the threshold. His back was straight. His hands were clenched into fists. He didn't say a word, but Daniel saw the back of his head and knew this wasn't the end. This was the first battle. Kaldani had lost publicly, and people like Kaldani do not forgive public defeats. The vote saves the bank, but it also forces Kaldani to abandon every cautious half measure. Daniel knows the next strike will target something larger than a poster, a wall, or his reputation. The city resumes its trade, yet the silence around the order feels like a blade being drawn. 3 weeks pass after the council victory, and Kaldani makes no visible move. No attacks, no complaints, no setbacks. Daniel knew that silence was more dangerous than noise. Kaldani was thinking. He was preparing. He was looking for another way. Daniel wasn't sitting idle either. By the 9th month, the bank serves 150 clients in Lorenza and 47 in Velmar. It holds 6,000 crowns, manages 6 active loans, and has issued 7 interest-free restoration loans. Mary Winter has repaid 1/3 of her debt, hired 2 apprentices, and booked orders 3 months ahead. Daniel decided it was time to open a 3rd branch, Holdwick, a port city in the east, the capital of a duchy hostile to Velmar. Salt mines, fishing, hard-earned money, and tough people. Moretti said Daniel was walking into the lion's den. Holdwick and Velmar were on the brink of war over the salt mines. Opening a bank in both cities means finding oneself caught between 2 armies. Daniel replied that this was exactly what was needed. A bank that operates in both cities becomes a bridge. A bridge does not wage war. Both sides need a bridge. Moretti looked at him long and hard. Then he said that Daniel was either a genius or a suicide. Daniel said that in finance the two are often one and the same. For Holdwick, he needed a special person, not Amelia. Amelia was perfect for Velmar. Warm, charming. Velmar was a city of diplomats and merchants. Holdwick was different. A cold city, straightforward people. They needed someone there who could see right through people and wasn't afraid to tell the truth to their face. Daniel thought about it for 3 days. Then he remembered a conversation at the market. A month ago, Amelia had mentioned a woman, a foreigner from the east, a former diplomat, living quietly in Lorenza, almost unnoticed. No one knew where she was from. No one knew why she was here. But Amelia said that this woman spoke 6 languages, and once, during a 10-minute conversation, had guessed that a spice merchant was cutting saffron with turmeric just by the tone of her voice. Daniel asked Amelia to find her. Amelia found her. Lee Sun-hyun lived in a room above a bookbinder's workshop on a quiet side street. She came to the bank at noon. She entered silently like So-yeon, but differently. So-yeon moved quietly because she was a hunter. Sun-hyun moved quietly because she was used to being invisible. Short, delicate features. Black eyes that looked as if they saw 3 layers deeper than others. A slight half-smile, constant. Like a mask or like a shield. She sat down across from Daniel and said nothing. She waited. Daniel began to speak. He explained that he needed someone to assess people, a credit analyst, someone who looks at a borrower and understands whether they'll pay back the money or not. Not based on numbers, but on the person. Sun-hyun listened. Her half-smile didn't change. When Daniel finished, she asked one question. She asked if he knew who she was. Daniel said he didn't know and wasn't asking. Sun-hyun was silent for 5 seconds. Then she said she was a former intelligence agent for the Far Eastern Empire, that her mission had failed. That back home she'd been sentenced to death in absentia, that she lived in Lorenza because no one was looking for her there. She warned that if Daniel wanted to hire a spy, he should know exactly what he was getting into. Daniel replied that he wasn't hiring a spy. He was hiring someone who knew how to read people. She had done it to destroy. He was offering her a chance to do it, to build. The difference lay not in the skill, but in the direction. Sun-hyun looked at him for 10 seconds. Her half-smile turned into a genuine one for a moment. Then it faded back to its usual state. She said she wanted to give it a try. Daniel took her to Hannah. Hannah looked at Sun-hyun. Sun-hyun looked at Hannah. The 2 women silently sized each other up. Hannah said that everything in the notebook was in its proper place, and that the new employee needed to memorize it. Sun-hyun replied that she had already memorized it, and that the 5th line on page 43 was written twice. Hannah opened the notebook. She checked. It wasn't a calculation error. It was a duplicate entry made while copying the data. A minor detail. But Sun-hyun had noticed it after flipping through the notebook for 15 minutes. Hannah closed the notebook and said the new employee would do. That was the highest praise in Hannah's vocabulary. Sun-hyun began her work. Her first task was to go with Daniel to Holdwick to assess the situation, who could be trusted, who to fear, and where to find clients. They leave 1 week later, with So-yeon beside Daniel, and Sun-hyun riding slightly behind to observe. Holdwick greeted them with rain and the smell of fish, a gray city, heavy stone houses, a harbor crammed with ships, people with weather-beaten faces, and terse speech. Sun-hyun spent 2 days at the market, 2 days at the harbor, 2 days in the taverns. She would return in the evening and give Daniel her reports, verbal, precise, merciless. The head of Holdwick's Merchants Guild takes bribes from smugglers. His deputy hates him and is waiting for an opportunity. The 3 largest merchant houses are related by marriage and control the import of salt. The order of the scales is weaker here than in Velmar, but they have an ally, the port magistrate, who detains shipments for non-payment of duties. Those duties never reach the treasury. They float into the order's pockets. Daniel listened and thought he'd hired the right person. Sun-hyun saw the city as a mechanism, gears, levers, pressure points. She knew where to apply pressure to make the mechanism turn in the right direction. He opened a branch in Holdwick 3 weeks later, faster than in Velmar, because Sun-hyun had found the right ally, the deputy head of the guild, a man named Eric Dalen. Ambitious, smart, he hated corruption not out of principle, but because it got in the way of his own plans. Sun-hyun introduced him to Daniel. Daniel offered him the same deal Salvini had offered in Velmar, an initial loan, better terms, and a partnership. Dalen agreed. The Holdwick branch was up and running, 20 clients in the first week. Port Salina was next, the 4th branch, a free port with no duke and no council. Anarchy with a trading license. Daniel sent Amelia there. Amelia opens the branch in 10 days and attracts 12 clients during the first week. The Bank of Lorenza now operates across 4 cities. A receipt issued in Lorenza was accepted in Velmar, Holdwick, and Port Salina. Money was no longer metal. Money became paper. Paper becomes trust. Exactly 1 year has passed since Daniel awakened in the wagon. 217 clients, 4 branches, 11,000 crowns in custody, 14 active loans, 9 employees, 5 vaults bearing Greta's seal. Over the course of this year, the Order of the Scales had lost more than a third of its client base in Lorenza. In Velmar and Holdwick, the losses were smaller, but the trend was clear. The merchants were leaving quietly, one by one, without a fuss. They simply stopped visiting the Order's offices and began walking into the bank instead. Kaldani had been silent for 2 months now. That was what frightened Daniel the most. Then Kaldani enters the Lorenza bank alone, wearing the same red doublet and the same ruby ring. But something had changed. Daniel saw it right away. Kaldani had aged. Not physically, somehow differently. Like a building ages when a load-bearing beam is removed from it. It's still standing, but not quite the same. Kaldani sat down across from Daniel. He placed his hands on the table. He looked him in the eye and he offered a partnership. Not an ultimatum, a partnership. The Order of the Scales and the Bank of Lorenza together, unified network. The Order's resources, the bank's technology. Kaldani offered Daniel the chance to lead the combined organization formally. Kaldani would remain the managing partner in the shadows, with ownership divided 50-50. The proposal made sense from a business standpoint. The Order had what the bank lacked: a network of offices in 12 cities, a staff of 80 people, vaults stuffed with gold, connections at the courts of 4 kings. But Daniel knew what lay behind it all. 50-50 meant that Kaldani would control the rates, that 30% would come back, then 40, then 50, that the recovery fund would close on the second day, that Mary Winter would once again be left without a forge, that the piece of paper would cease to be a token of trust and become yet another tool of pressure. Daniel refuses calmly and without explanation, while Kaldani receives the answer without surprise. He nodded slowly, like a man who had expected that answer, but still held out hope. Then he said the phrase that Daniel would remember forever. He said that Daniel had built a house out of paper, and that he would light a single match. Daniel replied that the paper would burn, but trust would not, and that he had already built it. Kaldani stood up. He looked down at Daniel. Then, for the first time since they'd met, his face was neither angry nor haughty, but sad. He said quietly that the world Daniel was building left no room for people like him, and that he didn't know where that place was now. He left. Daniel sat at the table and stared at the closed door. He had expected a threat. He got sadness. That was worse. What no one knew was Kaldani had already chosen where to strike next. The match is not struck in Lorenza. Kaldani attacks where the bank is weakest. He approached the Duke of Velmar in person with an offer the Duke could not refuse. Kaldani proposed that the Duke declare the Bank of Lorenza as counterfeit currency within the duchy. In exchange, the Order would write off the Duke's military loan of 1,000 crowns. The Duke of Velmar is practical, and 1,000 crowns outweigh the promises of an unknown banker. The decree was signed. The Bank of Lorenza's promissory notes were declared illegal tender within the Duchy of Velmar. Anyone presenting a receipt is subject to a fine. Anyone accepting a receipt as payment is subject to arrest. The news reached Daniel 3 days later via carrier pigeon from Amelia. Her handwriting was neat, but Daniel could see that the ink was smudged in places. She had written quickly. The Velmar branch had emptied out within a day. The clients had come to collect their gold. All of them at the same time. A real raid, not staged like the first time, the real thing. Amelia had handed everything over to everyone, down to the last coin, just as Daniel had taught her. No refusals, no haggling. The branch was empty. Formally, it still existed. In reality, it was dead. Daniel read the letter. Then he read it again, and that was when the chill came, rising from his stomach to his throat. Kaldani had found his weak spot. The bank operated on trust, and trust operated on the law. When the law says that a receipt is a crime, Trust evaporates like water on a hot stone. So Yan stood beside him. She was silent. Then she placed her hand on his shoulder. For the first time ever, her hand was warm and heavy. Daniel covered her hand with his for a second. Then he stood up. He said he needed the Duke. Not his ambassador, not his advisor, the Duke himself. So Yan asked how. Daniel said the Duke would run out of money sooner than he thought, because Kaldani had written off 1,000 crowns for him. But Kaldani hadn't told the Duke that the order itself was on the brink of bankruptcy, that clients were leaving, that revenues were falling, that in 6 months the order would have nothing left to lend the Duke. The Duke would then find himself without money and without a bank. Daniel knew this because Sun Haiyan had spent 3 weeks studying the order's finances quietly, discreetly, through indirect clues, through conversations, through the movement of goods, through how many servants Kaldani had fired, through how often his ship sat idle in the harbor. The order of the scales was dying slowly. Kaldani knew this. That was precisely why he had proposed a partnership. That was precisely why, after being refused, he struck. It was the desperate blow of a drowning man. Sun Haiyan's evidence gave Daniel something more valuable than a rumor. Proof that Kaldani could no longer survive a prolonged financial war. Daniel decided to appeal to the Duke personally and left Lorenza before dawn with the evidence packed beside him. Daniel reaches Velmar 6 days later, with So Yan beside him and Sun Haiyan following on horseback. Daniel hated horses, but now it was a familiar hatred, like his hatred of an alarm clock, a necessary part of life. He couldn't gain direct access to the Duke. Alaric III, Duke of Velmar, refuses to receive foreign merchants, especially one whose receipts he has criminalized. He needed an intermediary. Daniel turned to Salvini. The old man received him in the same tapestry-adorned hall. He listened. He shook his head. He said that Daniel was asking the impossible. The Duke had signed the decree. To revoke it would mean admitting a mistake. Dukes do not admit mistakes. Daniel said he wasn't asking for it to be revoked. Daniel asks only for an audience, claiming he needs just 10 minutes to show the Duke one crucial truth. Salvini asked what exactly. Daniel told him the truth. Salvini was silent for a long time. Then he said he would try. The audience was scheduled for 4 days later. Daniel prepared. He asks Hannah to send the bank's complete yearly report from Lorenza, including every figure and balance. He asked Sun Haiyan to prepare a dossier on the financial condition of the Order of the Scales, everything she could find. He asked Amelia to compile a list of Velmar merchants who had lost money because of the decree. She lists merchants harmed because the decree froze their receipts and blocked payments in other cities. 4 days remain. Daniel barely sleeps, while So Yan brings food to his room and watches him ignore it. He ate without looking up. He wrote, he calculated, he crossed things out, he rewrote them. On the 3rd night, So Yan walked into his room without knocking. She set a plate of bread and cheese on the table. She took away the previous one, which was untouched. She stood there for a moment. Then she sat down on the edge of the table. Daniel looked up. So Yan said he needed to get some sleep, 2 hours. Otherwise, tomorrow in front of the Duke, he'd look sick instead of like a banker. Daniel wanted to object. He looked at her. Her face was calm, but there was something in it he hadn't seen before. Concern. Not the kind of concern a bodyguard shows toward his charge. A different kind. He lay down. He fell asleep instantly. So Yan remained sitting by the door. He never sees her remain by the door, but somehow he knows. Then the morning of the audience arrives. The Duke's castle. Stone walls, torches, coats of arms, guards. The throne room. Duke Alaric III sits in a carved chair beneath the canopy. A man of about 45, a military face, broad shoulders, a scar on his left cheek, harsh eyes. 2 advisors and a secretary stood nearby. Daniel was given 10 minutes. He used 6. He didn't mention the receipts. He didn't mention the bank. He didn't ask for the decree to be revoked. He spoke of war. He said he knew about the conflict with Holdwick over the salt mines. He knew the Duke was preparing an army. He knew how much an army cost in the field. His calculations showed that the Duke would run out of money within 4 months. The Duke narrowed his eyes. Daniel continued. He said that the Order of the Scales had written off 1,000 crowns for the Duke. Generous, but the order itself is losing money. Clients are leaving. Revenues are falling. In 6 months, the order won't be able to give the Duke a new loan. Not because it won't want to, because it won't be able to. The Duke asked how Daniel knew this. Daniel placed the dossier prepared by Sun Haiyan on the table. Indirect data. The order's trade turnover, the number of closed branches, the number of laid-off employees, the amounts the order had stopped lending. It all pointed to one thing. The order was dying. The Duke read in silence. His advisors read over his shoulder. Their expressions changed. Daniel said he was offering the Duke an alternative, not promissory notes, a loan, a real loan in gold, at 12% interest for 2 years, an amount sufficient to maintain an army for 6 months. In exchange, Daniel asked for 3 things. Daniel demands 3 concessions: legal promissory notes, free movement for bank staff, and the Duke's official seal. The Duke was silent for a long time, a minute, maybe 2. Then he asked why 12 and not 50. Daniel replied that the Duke was neither a thief nor a swindler. The Duke had ruled Velmar for 20 years. His income was stable. His taxes were collected. His default risk is low, so 12% is fair for a reliable borrower, while 50% belongs to thieves. Daniel didn't say that calling the Duke a thief was unreasonable. He didn't say it because the Duke understood that himself. Alaric III smiled. It was the first time during the entire audience. He said that in 20 years, no one had ever called him a reliable borrower. Everyone had simply given him money and prayed. The decree is revoked that same day, and promissory notes become legal again. The Duke's seal was affixed to the document, granting the bank the right to operate under the protection of the crown. Daniel stood in the castle courtyard, holding the document in his hands. Parchment, a heavy wax seal. For the first time in Aaron's history, a sovereign recognizes a private bank rather than a moneylender's guild or exchange office. A bank with the right to hold deposits and extend credit. So Yan stood behind him, silent as always. Daniel turned to her. He thanked her for making him get some sleep. So Yan tilted her head slightly, and for the first time ever, Daniel saw her smile. Not a half smile, a shadow, a smile. Brief one, like a flash of light in a dark room. Then she turned away and went to check on the horses. News of the Duke's seal reached Holdwick in 4 days. The Duke of Holdwick sent an envoy to Lorenza a week later. He too wanted a loan. He too was preparing for war. He too knew that the order was dying. Daniel granted both a loan under identical terms to both. That was important. He wasn't taking sides. The bank served everyone like a bridge. 2 dukes preparing to fight each other were borrowing money from the same bank. Daniel knew what that meant, and he knew it would work. The pass in his pocket was hot, like red-hot metal. Daniel took it out at night in his room in Velmar. He looked at the photo, at the logo, at the magnetic strip, and he heard the sound again. A quiet murmur of numbers, closer than last time, clearer, as if someone were counting right next to him, behind the wall. Behind the thin wall between him and something he couldn't yet see. The war between Velmar and Holdwick begins on the first day of spring, 18 months after Daniel's arrival. It began predictably. The salt mines, the border, a crossbow skirmish, then the cavalry, then the first casualties. Both sides maintained their armies with money from the Bank of Lorenza. Both sides knew that Daniel was aware of their financial balances. Both sides pretended it didn't matter. Daniel waits through 3 weeks of fighting, mounting expenses, and rapidly shrinking treasuries. Then he sent letters to both dukes, identical letters, word for word. He invited their ambassadors to Lorenza to discuss finances, not peace, finances. The ambassadors arrived on the same day. Count Montalvo from Velmar, Baron Eriksson from Holdwick, 2 men who hated each other as representatives of states that hated each other. Daniel seats both envoys at the same table, where Kaldani once threatened him, and Morty first saw a 4% loss. So Yan stood by the door. Hannah stood against the wall with a notebook. Sun Haiyan stood by the window. Amelia sat in the corner with a pen, ready to take notes. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He placed two folders on the table, one in front of Montalvo, the other in front of Eriksson. Each contained a complete financial breakdown of the respective duchy, revenues, expenses, military expenditures, current balance, forecast for 3 months, for 6, for a year. Montalvo opened his folder. He read. His expression remained unchanged. Then it changed. Eriksson opened his. He read faster. His expression changed sooner. Daniel waited until both had finished reading. Then he spoke. He said that Velmar could wage war for months. By the 5th month, the treasury would be empty. There would be nothing to feed the army. The soldiers will scatter, while Holwick can sustain the war for only 3.5 months. By the 4th month, its ships would be grounded in port because there would be no money to pay the crews. Both duchies would go bankrupt. Both would lose their armies. Both would be left defenseless against any third neighbor wishing to take advantage of the situation. The salt mines would go not to the victor, but to the marauder waiting outside the war. He asked which week they would prefer to go bankrupt. The silence was so thick that Daniel could hear So Yin breathing by the door. Montalvo spoke first. He said it was blackmail. Daniel replied that it was simple arithmetic. Blackmail implies that the blackmailer has a choice. Daniel has no choice. If both duchies go bankrupt, the bank will lose its 2 largest borrowers. The ruin is not in his interest. Peace is in his interest. He isn't making threats. He's showing the numbers. Numbers don't lie. Eriksson asked what the banker was proposing. Daniel made his proposal. Joint operation of the salt mines. Profits are split 50-50. The Bank of Lorenza acts as guarantor of the deal. Both sides refinance their war loans into long-term loans at 8%. The war ends. The armies are disbanded. Expenses drop. Both duchies turn a profit within a year. Both, not just one. Both. Montalvo and Eriksson looked at each other. For the first time during the entire conversation, they weren't looking at Daniel. They were looking at each other, not as enemies, as two people who had been shown the same abyss at their feet. The negotiations lasted 2 days. Daniel sat at the table both days without getting up. Hannah brought him water. So Yin brought him food. Sun Hyan quietly whispered when one of the envoys was bluffing. Amelia wrote down every condition, every clause, every figure. At the end of the 2nd day, the treaty was signed. The salt mines became jointly owned. The war was over. Daniel sat in the empty office after the ambassadors had left. Everyone was gone. Hannah put away her notebook. Amelia took the minutes away. Sun Hyan slipped away silently. So Yan stood by the door, waiting. Daniel sat staring at the desk. On that desk, a war had just ended. Not with a sword, not with an army, with 2 folders full of numbers. He had prevented a war through economics. He sat there, unable to stand because his legs were trembling. So Yan approached silently. She stands beside him and rests a warm, steady hand on his shoulder, just as she did after the decree. Daniel covered her hand with his. This time, not just for a second. But then 1 week after the war ended, Vittorio Caldani vanished without a trace. His house was locked. The servants said their master had left during the night. The Order of the Scales closes its Lorenza office, while Caldani's house remains locked and empty. Its Velmar office closes 1 month later, followed by Holdwick 2 months after that. Some remained, the smaller ones in distant cities, but the monopoly had been shattered forever. Daniel didn't celebrate. He thought about Caldani, about his last words, about a world that leaves no room. He hoped that Caldani was alive, that he'd found another place. It was a strange feeling for a man whose enemy had just vanished. Daniel cannot help calculating the absence, because even an enemy holds a place in the equation. Remove that piece without explanation, and the silence it leaves behind feels less like victory than an unfinished sum. Another month passes, bringing the bank's 2nd anniversary and a vast gathering in Lauren Square. Daniel stood on the steps of the bank building. Before him were several thousand people, merchants, artisans, sailors, peasants from the suburbs, 2 ambassadors, a representative of Duke Velmar, bearing a letter. A representative of Holdwick stood nearby, peacefully, side by side. This, in itself, was a sight to behold. Daniel held a single sheet of parchment above the crowd, thin enough to tear and powerful enough to bind kingdoms. It was Aaron's first government bond, issued through the Bank of Lorenza and guaranteed by Velmar's crown. Any holder may present it and receive 100 crowns in any of the 7 cities where the bank operates. He raised the bond above his head. The square fell silent. He said that this piece of paper was worth 100 crowns, that if a beggar brought it, he would give him 100 crowns. If the king brought it, he would pay out 100 crowns. If he were killed tomorrow, it would still be accepted in the 7 cities. That was no longer his concern. It was theirs. He handed the bond to the first person in line, Mary Winter, a former blacksmith's widow. Now, the owner of a workshop with 4 employees and orders booked 6 months in advance. She had repaid her loan 3 months ago in full, down to the last coin. Mary took the bond with both hands. She looked at it, then at Daniel, and she nodded. A single nod. Just like So Yen, just like Hannah, just like all people who know the value of words, and therefore don't waste them. The crowd was silent. Somewhere in the back rows, stood the old merchant Tonio, who 2 years ago had wept when he saw how the double entry system caught the error on its own. Next to him were Bernardi and Ronaldo, the very same 2 who had been the first to transfer the money with the single line in the notebook, and had walked out exchanging glances like conspirators. Daniel looked at his people. Hannah was standing by the bank wall. She clutches the first ledger to her chest, the same one where she caught Daniel's original 2-crown error. She held the ledger so tightly that the worn leather bent beneath her fingers. Hannah wasn't crying, but her eyes were shining. Amelia stood next to her father. Moretti looked at his daughter and at the square, and his face was unlike anything Daniel had ever seen on him. Calm, Greta stood slightly to the side. Her arms were crossed over her chest. Her red hair had slipped out from under her headscarf. She was looking at the bank building, at the stones she had laid with her own hands, at her mark above the vault door, 3 crossed lines. She had built 5 vaults in 4 cities. Each one was signed. Sun Hyan stood by the 2nd floor window. She looked down from above. Her half smile was still there, but something new had appeared in it. A sense of belonging. She was no longer invisible. She was part of something. So Yen stood behind Daniel's shoulder, as always, in her usual spot, and for the first time, her hand rested not on the hilt of her sword, but on his shoulder. Anna Wright stood in the front row of the crowd, 19 years old, an orphan who a year and a half ago had brought a single gold coin wrapped in a handkerchief to the bank. She had asked the bank to keep it safe until she came of age. She returned 6 months late, not for the gold, with the request to teach her everything. Daniel made her his personal secretary. He gave her access to his records, to his calculations, to his thoughts on paper. She was the future, not his future, the bank's future. The bank had to outlive the banker. After the speech, the crowd dispersed slowly. People were talking quietly, like people who had seen something important and hadn't yet realized just how important it was. Daniel returned to his office. He sat down at his desk. The pass lay in front of him, hot, almost scorching. The muttering of numbers was loud, not from behind the wall, from inside the room. He looked up. 2 people were standing in the doorway, an old man and an old woman, in plain gray clothes. He hadn't heard them come in, so Yen hadn't stopped them. It was strange. So Yen usually stopped everyone. The old man approached the table. He placed a small object on the counter, a brass weight, smooth, heavy for its size, a standard unit of weight. Daniel looked at the weight, then at the old man. The old man said 2 words. The old woman thanks Daniel for coming, and tells him they have been waiting. It was warm like the pass, the same warmth. He asked who they were. The old man said they were the guardians of measure, that their order had existed for 1,000 years, that they believed in one thing. Civilization is held together by an honest reckoning. When the reckoning is dishonest, civilization collapses. 1,000 years ago, they lost the last person who knew how to count in a way that others would trust. Since then, they've been waiting for a new one. Their summoning ritual worked when the world reached a breaking point. 3 years of crop failures, war on the horizon, trade was suffocating, and ordinary life was collapsing. The world was on the brink. They needed a man who knew how pipes worked, not one who built palaces, one who laid the pipes through which water flows. They found Daniel, not because he was a genius, not because he was rich, because at the moment of his death, his last thought was for the safety of others. Wet marble. He thought about how he needed to warn the caretakers so that someone else wouldn't slip. It was a thought for others, not for himself or his pain, only that someone else might slip, and that warning them mattered. At the moment of his own death, the Guardians had been waiting for this for 1,000 years. Daniel sat and looked at the brass object in his hand. He wanted to ask so many questions. Why him? How does it work? What happens next? Is it possible to go back? But he asked only one question. He asked if this was the first task or the last. The old man smiled. The old man explains that this is only Daniel's first task, and others will follow. But not today, because today, Daniel is finally allowed to rest, and the Guardians quietly leave. Daniel was left alone in the office, the brass object in one hand, the pass in the other. Both were warm. He placed them side by side on the desk. He looked at them. 2 objects from 2 worlds. One had brought him here. The other had told him why. The door opened. So Yen looks at him and quietly asks whether everything is all right. Daniel said yes. Then he thought for a moment and said no. Then he said he didn't know, so Yen nodded. She came in. She closes the door, sits beside him, and lets a deep, comfortable silence settle between them. Outside the window, a flag fluttered above the bank's roof. A white banner on it, a simple symbol, a set of scales. Downstairs in the main hall, Hannah was closing her notebook. The last entry of the day, debits equal credits. The total is 0. Everything is in place. Everything adds up. In Velmar, Amelia stamps the final document with a brass seal bearing the initials AM. In Holdwick, Sun Hyan sat across from a merchant, listening to his story, and knew within the first 2 minutes that she could grant him a loan. In Port Salina, the trading day was drawing to a close, and bank receipts were passing from hand to hand as a matter of course. In a workshop on the outskirts of Lorenza, Mary Winter was blowing out the forge after the workday. 4 workers were heading home. Aaron's first government bond hung on the wall. 100 crowns. Mary had it framed, not because she needed 100 crowns, but because she needed to remember. In her room, Anna Wright was transcribing Daniel's notes into a separate notebook by candlelight. His formulas, his principles, his metaphors that had become terms, the principle of the 3 baskets, the rule of warm bread, and Rose's law. She copies everything because she understands Daniel's deepest rule. A person is mortal, an institution is not, so knowledge must outlive the person who first carried it. Daniel sat in his office, so Yan was beside him. Silence. Warmth. He thought that 2 years ago he had been the vice president of operational risk at an investment bank in Manhattan. A cog in the machine, a number on a list. A man whose death would have prompted a half-page obituary in the corporate newsletter and a minute of silence at the morning meeting. But here, he had built a machine from scratch. Every screw, every gear, and the machine worked. And it will keep working when he's gone. Because Hannah knows how to keep track of things. Because Amelia knows how to talk to people. Because Greta knows how to build walls. Because Sun Hyan knows how to read people. Because So Yan knows how to protect. Because Anna knows how to preserve knowledge. Because Mary Winter knows that an investment in a person always pays off. Daniel looked out the window. The sun was setting behind the rooftops of Lorenza. The flag with the scales was darkening against the orange sky. Across 7 cities, people carry slips of paper in their pockets that are worth as much as gold. Because behind every piece of paper stood a word, and behind the word stood trust. And behind the trust stood a man who once woke up in a wagon with a bow and decided things could be better. So Yen shifted slightly and her shoulder brushed against his. Daniel didn't pull away. He closed his eyes. The pass on the table had grown cold. For the first time in 2 years, it was cold, calm, like a mechanism that had fulfilled its task and was waiting for the next one. Daniel thought that the next task could wait until tomorrow. Today, he would just sit in silence next to a person whose silence was so profound that it felt warm. In the building he had built, in the world he had changed.